لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعين ونستغفره ونؤمن به نتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي أما بعد. There are many figures in our history that we don't know enough about. I mentioned before that we don't spend enough time studying our own history. And as a ummah, many of us have gaps in our knowledge of history. I mentioned last week that for many Muslims, there is a misconception of history that there were only 4 Sahaba who served as Khulafa. 4 or 5, right? Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and Muawiyah radiallahu anhum ajma'in. Actually, there were 7. There were 7 Sahaba who served as Khalifa. Most people don't know this. Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman, then Ali, then Hassan, then Muawiyah, and then after Yazid comes Abdullah ibn Zubayr. And Abdullah ibn Zubayr is the one that's forgotten about. He's the one that nobody speaks about. He's the one that many people don't even know about. Yet according to many historians, he is the legitimate Khalifa of that generation. So today, inshallah, very briefly, we will go through the biography of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. His childhood, his virtues, his khilafat, and his death. Because this is a Sahabi who we should know about. He is an important figure in our history. He is the archetype of the righteous rebel. Someone who rebelled against tyrants and did it in a righteous way. And he's an important figure because today, there are certain movements that are trying to paint him as a bad guy. Right? Certain movements want us to believe that there's no situation where rebellion is ever acceptable. So to do that, they have to rewrite history and portray Abdullah ibn Zubayr as some kind of villain. In reality, he's amongst the righteous of the Sahaba. So Abdullah ibn Zubayr is from the lowest rank of the Sahaba. What we mean by the lowest rank of the Sahaba is that he's only around 9 years old when the Prophet ﷺ passes away. So he doesn't get to spend any of his adult life accompanying Rasulullah ﷺ. He's actually born into Islam. He's born into Islam. And he is born in Medina. And even the story of his birth is special. Abdullah ibn Zubayr is the son of Zubayr ibn Awam and Asma binti Abi Bakr. So his father Zubayr and his grandfather Abu Bakr are from the Ashara Mubashara, the blessed 10. And his mother is Asma, and we all know the virtues of Asma, the great and courageous woman from amongst the Muhajirat. And his aunt is Aisha radiallahu anha, Asma's sister. Interesting note, what is Aisha radiallahu anha's kunya? Abdullah, mother of Abdullah. Why? She didn't have any children. Why is she called the mother of Abdullah? Because she helps raise Abdullah ibn Zubayr. Because she, as the khala of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, is like a second mother to him. So she gets the kunya Abdullah. Look how close they are, right? Aisha radiallahu anha's kunya is related to Abdullah ibn Zubayr because she helps raise him. So he's born into a very virtuous family. And what happens is, when the Sahaba of Makkah migrate to Medina, there is a rumor in Medina that the Jews, always the Jews, have done some kind of jadoo or sihr to prevent the people of Makkah from having male children. And this rumor goes about for a few months. And for a few months, there's no male children born to the people of Makkah. So people start to think, is the rumor true? Did they really do something to us? And they're about 10 or 11 months after they move from Makkah to Medina, Asma binti Abi Bakr gives birth to her first son. And Rasulullah ﷺ himself names this child Abdullah. And so the birth of Abdullah ibn Zubayr is a cause of celebration to the people of Medina. It's proof that this rumor was false and that they're going to have healthy children. And his birth is celebrated by the Prophet ﷺ himself, who carries him and names him. And he grows up in Medina. And he grows up under the guidance of the likes of Zubayr ibn Awam and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq and Asma binti Abi Bakr and Aisha binti Abi Bakr. These are his family. These are his role models. These are his parental figures. And Abdullah ibn Zubayr grows into a mighty warrior. Abdullah ibn Zubayr is known for three things. Number one, being a warrior. Right? He is known as a mujahid, a warrior. His whole life is that of being a warrior. To such an extent that some historians say that his first word as a baby was safe, which means sword. Right? His first word as a baby was pointing to a sword and saying safe, sword. And he lived by the sword and he died by the sword. Abdullah ibn Zubayr was a warrior. He spent his youth and the bulk of his adult life in the front lines fighting in jihad. In the reigns of Osman and Muawiyah, Abdullah ibn Zubayr is in the front lines fighting the non-Muslims in jihad. Right? That is the bulk of his life. He's also known for speaking his mind, for his eloquence. He wasn't somebody who shied away from what he believed in. And we saw this in the previous weeks, that he was the most outspoken against Yazid. From all of the critics of Yazid, the most outspoken was Abdullah ibn Zubayr. He would not stand for Yazid's tyranny. Interestingly, the third thing that Abdullah ibn Zubayr is known for is his khushu' in salah. His concentration in salah. To such an extent, you can open any book today about khushu', about concentrating in your salah, it is full of examples of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. He becomes the role model of concentrating in your salah. There are stories where he'd be praying salah and a snake would enter the house and he wouldn't even know there's a snake in the house. It said that when Abdullah ibn Zubayr would pray salah, he would go into a different world. He would be completely disconnected from this dunya. It's as if the dunya ceases to exist and all that remains is him and his Lord. He achieved a level of concentration in salah that is legendary. And so he becomes the role model of khushu'. And really, go and open any of the books about khushu' in salah. Any of the books, whether it's the books of Al-Ghazali, whether it's Fadail Amal, whatever it is, you will find story upon story of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. Because he is the role model of khushu'. An interesting note on his concentration in acts of worship. Abdullah ibn Zubayr was someone who would never want to miss an act of worship. And so he's the only person we know historically who performed tawaf while swimming. He's the only person we know of historically who performed tawaf while swimming. What we mean by this is that during the lifetime of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, there was a flood in Makkah. So during the flood, everybody stayed away from the Kaaba, everyone stayed indoors. Except for Abdullah ibn Zubayr, he swam around the Kaaba 7 times to perform tawaf. So he becomes the only one who performs tawaf while swimming. So Abdullah ibn Zubayr is an amazing figure in our history. This is a man of khushu', this is a man of jihad, this is a man of speaking his mind, this is a man born into a great family, raised by great people, who really becomes one of the greatest of the Sahaba of his generation. Many decades later, he becomes a pivotal figure in our history, very late in his life. When the story of Yazid and Karbala takes place, Abdullah ibn Zubayr is like 62 years old. All the other stories we mentioned now is in his youth, right? Now we're talking 50 years after the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said he was like 10 years old when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away. So 50 years later, he's a 60-year-old man. Now you can imagine, when you have in the community a 60-year-old man like Abdullah ibn Zubayr, who has the khushu' of that level, and the biography of that level, and the lineage of that level, and Yazid becomes the Khalifa. You can imagine the disconnect here, right? And so he refuses to give bay'ah to Yazid. And he takes over Makkah and establishes it as a separate region outside the control of Yazid. And then when Karbala happens, that's the last straw. And that's when Abdullah ibn Zubayr declares himself the Khalifa. That's when Abdullah ibn Zubayr decides that this man Yazid is not fit for power. He declares himself the Khalifa as the rival of Yazid. And what results is a 14-year war between Abdullah ibn Zubayr and the Umayyads over the Khilafat. A 14-year war. Now what many people don't realize is that after Yazid dies, there's a lot of confusion over who is actually the Khalifa. Because you have a rebel in in Kufa, claiming to be the Khalifa who wants revenge for Hussein. You have the Umayyads in Syria, at that point in time Marwan ibn Hakam, claiming to be the Khalifa. And you have Abdullah ibn Zubayr in Makkah, claiming to be the Khalifa. So you have 3 people claiming to be the Khalifa at the same time. And what actually happens is, the majority of the Muslim world give bay'ah to Abdullah ibn Zubayr. This is what a point in our history many people don't know about. After Yazid dies, the majority of the Muslim world give the bay'ah to Abdullah ibn Zubayr. And this is why most of the historians consider Abdullah ibn Zubayr the legitimate Khalifa of that point in time. Because if Abdullah ibn Zubayr is ruling the majority of the Muslim world, and the Umayyads are ruling one region and fighting against him, who's the Khalifa and who's the rebel? So Abdullah ibn Zubayr at one point in our history becomes the Khalifa over the majority of the Muslim world. But we know that history went in a very different direction. So what happened? This is the awkwardness of history, right? What happens? Because how do we go from Abdullah ibn Zubayr ruling the majority of the Muslim world besides Kufa and Syria, and 10 years later he only has control over Makkah and the Umayyads control everything else? What happens? The awkward reality of history. Just because somebody is more pious than somebody else, it doesn't mean they're better at politics than them. Right? The reality is Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, and we'll discuss his biography next week because he also did some great things. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan becomes the leader of the Umayyad Empire and the chief rival of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. And while Abdullah ibn Zubayr is more pious, has a higher lineage and a better, more virtues and higher status than Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, the reality is Abdul Malik ibn Marwan is much better at strategies and politics. He just knows his way around the battlefield better. He knows how to win the loyalty of people better. One of the biggest political mistakes of Abdullah ibn Zubayr is that he didn't do enough to maintain the loyalty of his governors. Right? He just assumed that people will be loyal to him. And the Umayyads, on the other hand, they knew how to buy people's loyalty. And they knew how to get people's loyalty. And so one by one, they take over each of the regions from Abdullah ibn Zubayr. Some of them through war, many of them just through buying off the governor. And the sad reality is many of these governors are the brothers and the nephews of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. But they switch sides and side with the Umayyads against him. So this is just the reality of war and politics, that Abdullah ibn Zubayr is an amazing Sahabi. He has so many virtues. He's a righteous man. But he wasn't politically prepared for civil war. And for fighting somebody who was more politically savvy in this area. Furthermore, the Umayyads, specifically Abdul Malik, he hires one of the most brutal dictators in our history to get rid of Abdullah ibn Zubayr, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. If you haven't heard of Hajjaj, Google him. He's a strange character in our history. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf is one of the greatest tyrants in Muslim history. He oppressed and killed many Sahaba. But he also prayed 5 times a day and never drank alcohol. In his private life, he's like a pious person, and in public, he's an absolute tyrant. Again, our history is full of strange stories like this, where we want to box people into heroes and villains, and sometimes they're just a mixture of good and bad qualities in one person. So Hajjaj ibn Yusuf is the one put in charge of ending the rebellion and bringing the entire land under Umayyad rule. He's the main military dictator and military commander who's put in charge of doing this. And he goes into Makkah, he defeats Abdullah ibn Zubayr, and that land becomes part of the Umayyad Empire, and the civil war ends, and the reign of Abdul Malik begins. Next week, inshallah, we'll talk about Abdul Malik and his reign, because he actually did a lot of good for this ummah as well, and there's actually a lot of lessons we can learn from his reign as well. But today our focus is on Abdullah ibn Zubayr. We should learn more about Sahaba like Abdullah ibn Zubayr. He teaches us that sometimes rebellion is the righteous thing to do. He teaches us how to speak the truth and stand by the truth even when the forces of the world are against you. He teaches us how to pray with khushu, how to never miss a chance at ibadah. He teaches us how to stand up for justice. People ask, what did anyone do about Karbala? Abdullah ibn Zubayr's whole life was trying to get revenge for Karbala. He didn't let it go. He didn't let it pass. And so Abdullah ibn Zubayr is a role model from amongst the Sahaba, and someone whose life we must study deeper, and from whose life we must take lessons, because he is the model of the righteous rebel. And we ask Allah to guide us to understand this religion properly and to benefit from our history. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. The story of the death of Abdullah ibn Zubayr is actually quite inspirational. It's sad and inspirational at the same time. Abdullah ibn Zubayr loses all of his supporters and he's left in Makkah alone, just him and his mother. At this point in time, Abdullah ibn Zubayr is like 75 years old. And his mother is like 100 years old and blind. Remember, his mother is from the Muhajirat, people who made Hijrah. And this is like 80 years later. So she's like 100 years old and blind. And she's living with her son. And he realizes that it's over. Everyone has abandoned him. His own siblings and nephews have joined the Umayyads and given up hope in his leadership. So he goes to his mother for advice. He knows Hajjaj is brutal, he's ruthless, he's going to do very bad things to him. So he asks his mother for advice, should I give up? And his mother tells him that if you were fighting for a wrong cause all these years, you wasted your life. But if you are fighting for the truth, why would you ever give up? Die for what you believe in. His mother encourages him to die for what he believes in. Then he tells his mother, I'm worried that they're going to mutilate my body after I die. Now these people really hate me. They want to make an example of me. His mother says, once you're dead, you're not going to feel anything. It's over. So don't worry about what they do to your body after you die. And then he hugs his mother, and she's blind, so she can't see him. She hugs him, and she realizes he's wearing many layers of armor. And she gets a bit upset with him about this, and said, this is not the way a warrior dresses. This is like a cowardly way of dressing with so many layers of armor. You go into war, you're not someone who's scared of death. And again, imagine this is a 100-year-old lady speaking to a 75-year-old man, right? And encouraging him to go out and fight to the death by himself. And it is said that Abdullah ibn Zubayr fought the army of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf by himself at the age of 75. And he took an entire army to subdue him and to kill him. I want you to think about the kind of men the Sahaba were. That one man at the age of 75 could fight an entire army by himself. It's a level of masculinity that doesn't exist today. So Abdullah ibn Zubayr is killed, fighting for what he believes in. What started with Karbala only ends 15 years later when Abdullah ibn Zubayr is killed in Makkah. And Hajjaj doesn't just kill him. He hangs the body of Zubayr in front of the Kaaba. This was a practice of some of the early kings to make an example of the enemies. That they would hang the bodies or heads in public so people can say, this is what happens people can see this is what happens if you rebel against us. So they literally hang the body of Abdullah ibn Zubayr in front of the Kaaba, and they want his mother to come and beg them to take it down. And the mother refuses to do so. Instead she goes and she confronts Hajjaj. And she tells him off for his tyranny. And she warns him that you may have taken my son's dunya, but he has destroyed your akhirah. How are you going to account to the day of judgment for killing a sahabi? And she stands her ground, and it's amazing. Asma maintains the same courage at the age of 100 that she did when she was a young lady. When she's a teenager, her father and Rasulullah are going for the hijrah, and Abu Jahl comes to her home and demands to know where they are. And she refuses to tell him, and he slaps her as she still stands her ground. This is Asma when she's young. 80 years later, she's 100 years old, she's blind, and she's standing up to Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Imagine the courage of this woman who stands up to Abu Jahl in her youth and stands up to Hajjaj ibn Yusuf in old age. And there's some karamat that take place here. Some of the historians say that even though they hung the body of Abdullah ibn Zubayr in public for many weeks, the body smelled better and better with each passing day. There was a fragrance of martyrdom and Jannah coming from the body of Abdullah ibn Zubayr. And eventually some of the Sahaba, they warned Hajjaj against what he is doing, and they basically admonished him to take down the body of Abdullah ibn Zubayr and to bury it. Abdullah ibn Zubayr and his mother are role models of righteousness. This is a man who is born into a family of warriors. His grandfather is Abu Bakr, and his father is Zubayr, and his mother is Asma. And his father's mother, Zubayr's mother, is the Prophet's aunt Safiya. You know who is Safiya? She is the one who, when the Battle of the Trench is taking place and some Jews get into the Muslim compound where the ladies are, she goes and chops off the Jew's head and throws it over the fence. That's his grandmother. He's literally born into a family of warriors. And he grows into a mighty warrior. And he becomes the model of a type of person who believes that he's fighting for justice and he's willing to die for that. And this is something that we should aspire towards. If you believe in a righteous cause, you should be willing to give your life for that righteous cause, for the sake of Allah. Abdullah ibn Zubayr is the role model of a real man. And he's the role model of someone whose life was all about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and justice and this religion. And we ask Allah to grant the Sahaba the highest ranks of Jannah, to allow us to follow in their footsteps, to allow us to benefit from their example, and to allow us to benefit from this religion and from the teachings of this religion, from history. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين أقم الصلاة